Hello and welcome to Let's Talk Love. Today I had an excellent conversation with Connor Beaton. Connor is the founder of Man Talks, an international organization focused on helping men from all over the world find purpose, healthy love, a joy-filled life, and fulfilling sexual connection. Today we talk about Connor's new book, Men's Work, a practical guide to face your darkness, end self-sabotage, and find freedom. Connor is an excellent teacher and mentor. He says, the goal of this work is to become a more empowered, self-led man who can effectively impact the things that matter most to him. I've learned a lot about men through listening to Connor on Man Talks on his podcast and by reading his book. And I hope you learned something new today too. Welcome to Let's Talk Love, the podcast that brings you real talk, fresh ideas, and expert insights every week. Our guests are the most trusted voices in love and relationships, and they're here for you with tools, information, and friendly advice to help you expand the ways you love, relate, and communicate. We tackle the big questions, not shying away from the complex, the messy, the awkward, and the joyful parts of relationships. I'm your host, Robin Ducharme. Now, let's talk love. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of Let's Talk Love. I'm very happy to have our guest today, Connor Beaton. Connor, thank you for joining us on Let's Talk Love.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
I've been following your work for a few years now, Connor. And I'm just so happy for this opportunity to talk to you today. I was thinking this morning, I was like, this is the first time we've had a guest on to really just dive into the psychology of men. And like it just around the whole discussion around that. And I read your book, Men's Work.
Awesome.
This is a really solid piece of work that you put out, Connor. And I hope you're really proud of it. I learned a lot when I read it. And I'm excited to talk to you about it.
Awesome. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. It's been great. I mean, it's only been out for a month now, and men and women alike seem to really be loving the book and learning a lot.
Yeah.
And I think especially the guys that go through it, because there's so many exercises that I built into it for guys to do.
Definitely.
I think not every man wants to go to therapy, but a lot of guys are open to reading a book as sort of like the intro. And so I took a lot of the therapeutic principles and practices and put them in there. And it's doing well so far. Awesome.
And both you and Vienna released your books around the same time. So it's been busy for both of you. It's funny because I met with John Kim and Vanessa last week or a few weeks ago. They said their book tour is the new podcast shows are the new book tours. So you must be busy doing a lot of shows. But so Connor, tell us about your background. I'm fascinated because you're from Alberta. I'm Calgarian myself. And are you from Fort McMurray? Where are you from in Alberta?
I'm from right outside of Edmonton, a town called St. Albert.
St. Albert. Oh, wonderful.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and then I did some construction when I was like 18 to 22, I think, in northern Alberta, like near Camrose, and not as far as Fort McMurray, but yeah.
I know you said you worked in some of not the oil sands, but you did do some work in the oil patch, and my family is all there's a lot of oil and gas in our family.
Yeah.
I was just fascinated to hear some of your history around that. So tell us. Coming from Alberta, you're living in New York now with your family and doing so much work with your company, Man Talks. Tell us how you got there from working Alberta construction into where you are now doing working such thousands and thousands of men and helping them do the work.
Yeah. I mean, the condensed version is, I went to university, I got a music degry. It really
yes, opera. I was fascinated by that too, Connor. You've got a history with opera singing. That's so cool.
Yeah. I mean, it was a wild one, paying for my music degree, doing construction, building sidewalks and stuff like that. It was certainly not what I expected in high school, but it ended up working out well. I got to travel the world and perform, and it really taught me a lot about life and culture and people. And when I left that, because I didn't really like the career, I had hit a bit of a rock bottom in my life, and I was fortunate enough to have a mentor in my life at that time who was in his 70s. And he was just, he was very well versed in Jungian psychology and cognitive behavioral therapy and NLP and Gestalt and Buddhism and Zen and Taoism. And so I ended up spending about 2.5 years apprenticing with him, because I've always liked this model of, learning from the best, learning from the masters,
Yes.
and sort of sitting with them. And academia, nothing to knock it. I have nothing against it. It's just that's not necessarily the format that I'm proficient with. I can sit and watch somebody and observe somebody and replicate very quickly and learn very fast. But if I have to try and assimilate that knowledge or information from a textbook, it's much more conceptual for me. So I like the direct to consumer experience of learning from my mentor. And so I spent about 2.5 years with him, learning about Jungian psychology and shadow work and archetypes and Gestalt. And I've just continued that practice. Over the years, I've worked with some amazing PhDs and psychotherapists and psychologists and therapists along the way, and have learned a tremendous amount. I'm not a licensed psychologist or therapist, but I actually enjoy that. I actually like that in some ways, because I think, there's still a big stigma around men going to therapy. And, it's why our tagline within Man Talks is it's not therapy, it's training. And I like that notion, because I think for me as a man, I really liked the idea that I could train and develop myself into a better version, into a more grounded, coherent, self-led man, husband, leader, partner, business owner, etc. And so that's really what got me started. Is I had a career change, I had a rock bottom, I had a mentor in my life, thankfully, that helped to give me some guidance and direction. And that put me on this wonderful path where, I spent a few years working for Apple in the corporate world. And when I was doing that, I realized that I just had this pull to use some of the psychological tools and resources to support men that had been on a journey like myself. And so that led me to creating Man Talks probably about 8 or 9 years ago, I think about 9 years ago now. And it just took off, sort of immediately. Yeah. And it's changed a lot over the years to what it is today, where, I host live weekends and workshops online and groups. And there's, an online forum for men that has hundreds and hundreds of guys from all over the world. So it's been one heck of a ride, but I love every minute of it. I really feel like I found a sense of passion and purpose in life. So I'm very fortunate for that.
Definitely. So can you tell us really what Man Talks is about? I know you said it has definitely grown and changed over the years, in 2014. But what is it now? And what is it that you're helping men do? And through this book too, Connor, men's work. Like, what is this book about? What is it for? And what is Man Talk? Like, how is it that you're leading? You are mentoring men, right? And I love the fact that, you and even in your podcast, you talk so much about there's structure and there's practice. But I'm interested in like a man that would just be like, okay, I need to do that. Who are these men that are coming and asking for help from you and training? Yeah.
I mean, I think a lot of the men that come into our ecosystem, it's interesting because there's a very wide range of diverse backgrounds, very different lifestyles, guys from all over the world. But the commonality is we attract a lot of men who are tired of sabotaging, their sex life, their relationship, their finances, their health, guys that are really ready to get themselves on track, and men who are wanting tools and resources and sort of practical direction of how do I lead myself effectively as a man? Because I think that's one of the things that for myself, I wasn't leading myself in the ways that I wanted to. I was out of integrity. I was lying. I was cheating. I was sort of a mess. And that had a very real impact on the people around me in my life. And I didn't like that. And I don't think many men do. And I think that we live in a time where it's become much more socially acceptable for men to be highly domesticated and just sort of live a mediocre life, but a lot of men are just not happy in that. They don't like this sort of mediocrity that they've settled into in their career or their health or in their relationship. And so, the organization is really for men, and the work that I have produced through the podcast and the book and whatnot is really to give them challenges, tools, resources, but also community of other men who are doing this work. Because there is this notion that we as men need to still be the Lone Ranger, and that garbage just doesn't work. I know Absolutely it doesn't work because I tried it, because I've seen hundreds of men try it, and it just doesn't function. So part of what we do is provide a community for guys who are all going through this, who are working towards being better fathers, better husbands, better business leaders, better entrepreneurs, men who are committed to self-development. And I'll just wrap up by saying there's an institution out of the UK. I can't remember the exact name of it, but the guy's name is Dr. John Barry. And it's an institution that does a lot of research around men and masculinity. And what they've found through their research over the last couple of decades is that the number one thing that for men leads to a sense of fulfillment in their life is actually self-development. When we as men are working on our skills, bettering ourselves, working on expanding our businesses or our relationships or whatever it is that's very important to us, there's an intrinsic sense of fulfillment that starts to emerge out of that. Yes. So I think that's how I've tried to counter this sort of isolation and loneliness epidemic that has been emerging with men, and counter, a lot of the fatherlessness that a lot of men have experienced, not growing up with masculine role models at home or at school or in the workplace. It's not that we, need less masculinity in culture. It's actually that we need more healthy masculine examples and role modeling, because we as young boys and young men, or just as men in general, we learn through modeling. We learn through seeing what another man is doing and then developing ourselves alongside that. And so that type of modeling is incredibly important. So that's really what the book and the work is really all about. Yeah.
Wow. It's so I love it. And I've been learning so much from you, Connor, on your show and on who you're interviewing about men. I think it's awesome. It's just, I'm so happy that I'm learning from you, and I'm learning more about men in general. I mean, I've got two brothers. I've got of course my husband and a lot of family members that, it's almost like as a woman, I'm learning more about how men think and how they behave and why. And it's just, I think that's really important that we learn more about, there's just so much. So we'll dive into that. So one thing I did want to ask you about, which I really wanted to ask for clarity on, this idea that I heard you discuss on your podcast, is the decline of men. What exactly, can you please explain that concept to me and to our audience? What exactly does that mean? It's not the population. We're not talking about a decline of population of boys to girls or men to women. No, it's not that. It's something different.
Yeah, it's, there's a lot of research and data that's been coming out in the last few decades talking about a number of different things. One is the sort of meteoric rise of women within our culture, which is phenomenal. But there's been this steady decline of men, and that decline you can see in the plummeting college graduation rates, right? So something like 42% of the graduates from college this year will be men, 41 to 42%, and the other percentage is women, right? So you have less men than ever before graduating from college, and there's a number of substantial reasons for that, but there's this slow checking out from culture and society from men, right? So I'll give you a couple more data points and we can talk about this. Number one in 4 kids are going to grow up without a father in the household.
Wow. So when I actually heard that stat, I was just like, wow, that is such a high, 25%.
Yeah. And the interesting thing is that when you drilled further down into it, young girls who grow up with a single mother are largely unaffected. There's some data that shows that it might lead to a higher level of risky sexual activity or a number of other things, dropping out of school and stuff like that. But the young boys are the ones that really pay the price. So the stats around it are pretty wild, right? It's like 80% of high school dropouts come from fatherless homes, 90% of homeless people are coming from fatherless homes. And the majority of those high school dropouts and homeless folks are men. So young boys really are impacted by not having a father figure around. Then you can see within the college institution, right? Again, 42% of graduates. I have a lot of men that will, counter that and say, well, what does that matter? What about trades and these types of other things? Yes, to all of that, right? You can still make good money running your own business, working in a trade. I'm not saying that that's not a reality, but what is a reality is that 80% of women that have gone to college don't want to date or would prefer to date a man with a college degree. So if you're a man who's wanting to, have a long-term committed relationship, build a family one day, and, there's this certain caliber of women that you're wanting to date, the reality is that there's a huge subset of women that won't see you as a viable option simply because you don't have a college degree. So that's just one piece. I think the other piece of decline within men is isolation. A lot of, I think it's something like, I think it's 18% in a recent poll that was done, was 18% of men under the age of 30 can't even identify a best friend, right? Not one. And in the last few decades, we've seen this steady decline of male relationships, of men having other relationships, and this steady increase of men checking out from relationships. So a couple more things, and then I'll just pause here for a second. When you look at the percentage of men who aren't being sexually active or in a relationship, it's gone up 3 to 4 times in the last decade alone. So that 27% of men under the age of 30 either haven't been sexually active in the last year or at all. And so you have this, and again, that's up from like 13% a decade ago. And when you look at women are at 13 or 14% right now. So you can just see this increase in isolation, of disconnecting from male relationships, of disconnecting from female relationships, not dating, not being in a relationship. And you have also, lastly, an increase in, there are more men living at home than in a relationship under the age of 29, right? So you have this kind of retreat from culture and society. And where a lot of these men are going is onto online forums, right? They're just sort of living in the digital space. They're, and this isn't to knock them, right? This isn't necessarily quote unquote their fault. It's not to pass blame on anybody. There's a lot of pieces that are responsible for this. We see that things like the education system, for example, right? Young boys' prefrontal cortex develops later than young girls. Speech centers, decision-making centers, all of these things develop later. And so when you put a 5-year-old or a 6-year-old into education, when you put a 5 or 6-year-old boy and against a 5 or 6-year-old girl, she will naturally be developmentally about 2 years ahead of him. Yep. And so that young boy, the majority, maybe not all, but the majority of young boys are going to naturally and inherently struggle. And so this is why you see grades between boys and girls throughout the lower education, between grade 1 and grade 12. There's this huge discrepancy that has started to emerge because, for a number of reasons from a neurological and developmental standpoint. So these are some of the indicators. There's many more, but I think that this just gives a good context for what that quote unquote decline looks like within young boys and young men.
Yep. We at Real Love Ready are so excited to be hosting In Bloom, a love and relationship summit, April 14th and 15th, 2023 in Vancouver, BC. Join us for an insider pass to the most trusted relationship expertise, an intimate weekend of in-person or virtual learning, growth, and community. We're bringing you the insights and tools you need to learn and bloom in your relationships. Head over to realloveready.com to learn more and get your tickets. We truly hope to see you there. And so you talked about isolation, you know, that's such a big contributor to what's going on with boys and men. And in your book, you have the one rule of men. And can you talk to us about the one rule of men, Connor? And then I really wanted you to share the story about when you were in your phase of your life, when you definitely had hit rock bottom and you sat across from one of your best friends, and just how that conversation went. Because when I read that, I was like, wow, that was a powerful story.
Yeah, well, the if anybody's watched Fight Club, which I encourage everybody to go do, because it's sort of a commentary on masculine culture and male culture within our modern society, and I think it's more applicable now than ever before. But in Fight Club, the first rule of Fight Club is you don't talk about Fight Club, and that's a take on what I call the one rule of men, or my one rule of men is a take on the rule of Fight Club, which is when you're a man who's struggling or suffering, don't talk about it. You just don't talk about it. You don't talk about what it's like to be a man going through divorce, who's lost a parent. You don't talk about what it's like to be a man who's been living in a sexless marriage for 2 years, unhappy in his relationship, unhappy and depressed in his career. You just don't talk about that stuff. And one of the other things that I talk about in the book is this notion of isolation. It's not just socially isolating ourselves. It's actually isolating the parts of us as men that we don't want to talk about. And when we do that, the very simple reality is that isolation equals amplification. So when you isolate yourself because, maybe you're feeling anxious or depressed, or, you don't like your job, or you're struggling in your marriage, that isolation is going to amplify your internal experience. So rather than working through the depression or working through the anxiety or whatever the perceived issue is, you actually amplify that experience because there's nowhere for it to go. You're not discussing it. You're not talking about it. And as men, we've sort of bought into this notion for decades that has become very counterproductive, that says there's strength in suppression, that you as a man will be more masculine, more manly, and more competent the more you're able to suppress what you're experiencing. And the result of that is, as I experienced, is catastrophic, right? If that type of suppression leads to needing to numb out through drinking or drugs or, copious amounts of pornography or gambling or, whatever it is, reckless and endangering behavior, antisocial behavior, there's a byproduct to that suppression. When we're suppressing our anger, our frustration, our bitterness, etc., we personally pay a price for it, but then we also need something to help us push it down. So to answer your last part, I mean, I did hit a rock bottom in my life. I was out of integrity in a lot of ways, and was lying to people and cheating and unfaithful, and was very much unhappy, was abusing substances behind the scenes, and nobody knew. Nobody really knew what was going on in my life or within me, and how I was struggling. And I had bought into this idea that was making me a strong man in some way, shape, or form by holding all that shit in. And it just sort of all collapsed, relationship ended, decided to leave my career. And I didn't want to tell anybody what was going on because I was still bought into this notion that I had to figure it out by myself. And that by admitting to other people what was going on, that I was somehow weak and weaker. And for a lot of us as men, that is the thing that we do not want to admit. We don't want to admit where we feel weak, where we feel powerless, where we feel helpless. And so we withhold it. And in the conversation that I write about in the book, I had a conversation with one of my buddies and told him everything that had been going on behind the scenes. And he thanked me and he broke down, and my transparency, my courage and my willingness to be transparent with him allowed him to just be honest back and be transparent back. And he proceeded to tell me about how he'd been struggling with severe depression and had tried to commit suicide a month and a half before our conversation. And, it hit me that I knew everything about this guy. I had a very sort of quintessential male relationship. I knew the type of his favorite scotch, his favorite TV show, where he liked to eat, the women he liked to date.
And you would say, like, this is one of your best friends,
Yeah.
right? But
Yeah,
really, you don't, and you say that in the book. You said you were just shocked that you're like, you came to the realization that you don't really know this. You don't know each other. You're not sharing what is so real and important in your lives, right?
Yeah, there was depth missing from the relationship, and I think that this is what
which
a
is
lot
so
of
common.
men, which I think is what a lot of men are experiencing. You know, it's very common for most women to have very open and transparent relationships where they talk about the majority of things. That's not the case for most men, because we have these very competition-based relationships where we don't talk about the intricacies and the nuances and the vulnerabilities, right? The, dare I say, use the V word, right? The vulnerabilities of what we're actually experiencing, how we feel incompetent in the boardroom or the bedroom, in our finances, in our health, and we just don't openly talk about those things. And so part of my mission is to be able to give men the tools and the resources and the community to talk about those things, but then to also give them the tools and the resources to develop the competencies. Because I think part of the inherent reason why, I get this question all the time: why don't more men go to therapy? How come men don't?
Oh
go to
yes,
therapy?
I love your answer to this, Connor. This was I was like blown. I was talking to my husband about it. Tell us why. And there's a really good reason why.
Well, I'm curious what your husband thought about it, but yeah, I mean, the big piece is sort of twofold. One, it's that only 29% of psychologists are male, and it's even less, right? Even less therapists are male, and two, the therapeutic model, for the most part, is based off of the medical model, which is about talking about the symptoms, triaging and medicating. And so a lot of men go into therapy, and what happens is that therapeutic model, because it's so female focused, it aims to have you feeling heard and understood and accepted. And those are important things. That's not to say that those aren't important things, but a lot of men are sure they're needing that. They need to open up and be vulnerable and feel heard and understood, but they actually, in a lot of ways, are wanting to build competencies. They're wanting to develop skills. Yes. They're wanting to build this internal experience of I am capable, because that capability, that competency, is linked to a sense of self-power, self-worth, self-value. And so I think a lot of the therapeutic modalities that are out there are very powerful in helping men deal with their trauma, deal with childhood abuse, feel heard and understood, and help them make sense of things. But where it starts to really lack is in the ability to give men very specific direction and tools to develop competencies, to actually feel more competent in their relationship, in their conversations, sexually, in their finances, in their relationship to their own body. And so there's this gap that a lot of men experience. And I see this all the time. I mean, I'll say this last piece. I run these small 8-man groups called the Men's Self-Leadership Program. And they're these like 3 months intensives where I guide men through. And I had 2 of them just launch recently on Wednesday. And in both of the groups, multiple men said the exact same thing, which is, I have been to therapy, and I've been to therapy for years. And not only did I not get what I needed or wanted, but I have found more value in this one session than I got in years of therapy. And it's just this shift in, let's talk about how to develop yourself and your competencies. That was a good stutter right there. How to develop yourself and your competencies in life, because that's going to give you the strength and the assurance that a lot of men are looking for when it comes to, I know I'm valuable. I know I have worth. Because in our modern culture, the way that things have been set up, for better or for worse, is that a lot of men are looking to get their value reaffirmed by women and reassured by women, that women have become this sort of card holders of men's values to say, yes, you're a good man. No, you're not a good man. Yes, you're a man who has value. No, you're not a man who has value. Yes, you have worth. No, you don't. And so a lot of men are chasing this value. This is the nice guy syndrome, right? A lot of men are chasing after a woman's affection, validation, because he thinks that in order to feel valuable as a man or have worth as a man, he needs to get it from her, right? So his worth, his inherent value is outside of himself versus something that's within him that he can inherently develop.
Yes.
So
And
thanks for coming to my TED Talk.
No, I love it. I love it, Connor. This is just, all of it is very fascinating. And especially the learning that I've been gaining is around just how it is very different how you would approach a man versus a woman when it comes to this. Like you make that point about how, social media, you go on Instagram, you go on and you see, there's so many therapists that are women that have these large followings, and they are speaking to women, like talking, like you said before, like about vulnerabilities, like, and we want our men to be vulnerable. Well, what does that mean? And you make the point that, a man looking at that, a lot of men would just be like, that doesn't sit right with me. That's not, that's not, they already resonate with the fact that that's probably not going to work for me. I'll go to the gym or I'll do something else that is going to let out something, be some sort of therapeutic way of working through their stuff, because the model that we have predominantly on socials, for instance, doesn't speak to men.
Well, so like in the book, I write about the myth of male vulnerability, which is this notion that, culture and society is finally starting to talk about the challenges that men are going through, right? Because for a long time, there's been this notion that if you talk about the challenges or the obstacles or the issues that men are having or experiencing, that you're somehow anti-women. And I think that that's starting to collapse, right? We need to be able to talk about both. We need to be able to talk about the inherent challenges that men are facing culturally and women are facing culturally. Otherwise, what are we doing, right? You can't just talk about one side and not the other. Right. And maybe you need to oscillate a little bit. But anyway, there's the myth of male vulnerability looks at the challenges that men are facing in their relationships, in culture, in all areas of their life, and projects a more feminine or female oriented solution onto men that says the answer to all your problems is just be more vulnerable. And men hear that and they think, well, maybe vulnerability is the solution to some of my problems, surely, right? If I'm not talking, if I'm not opening up, if I'm not admitting or being honest with people in my life, but it can't be the total solution. And so that's a part of it, right? Because we have to build these competencies. But the other part is men know that there's a risk in opening up, period. Men know that there is a risk in opening up, even in our intimate relationships. Most men have some form of a story of being super open and super vulnerable in a relationship with a woman, and maybe talking about his past or talking about a previous heartbreak, and having that partner not be able to hear or hold what he went through, and it having negative consequences, right? Suddenly she's not interested in him. She's not calling him back. Maybe she's judging him. Maybe there's, a sort of criticism that he should have done something differently, or, she's not attracted to him sexually anymore, or all of a sudden the relationship ends 2 weeks later, so men know that there's this very real risk in being open and vulnerable, because historically women haven't even had the opportunity to see what a man's vulnerability looks like. And
so you talk about this in the book, Connor, right? About how that dynamic does play out. Mm-hmm. And you say that it's like women, maybe you could teach us about this. Women want to know that you've got this. Okay, tell me your emotional state. I want to know where you're at. How are you feeling? And we want to know that the men in our lives, like, they got it handled, right?
Yeah.
And so is that kind of explaining it in a nutshell?
Yeah, that's pretty much it, right? The misconception, like when we as men hear, oh, you want us to be vulnerable, a lot of guys take it and say like, okay, you want me to just tell you everything that's going on inside of me. And so we bring our complaints about work and, all the stuff that we're feeling about our parents and stuff like that. And it's unprocessed, uncontained, undealt with. It's sort of like, here's this emotional mess that I am feeling and experiencing. And because a lot of men don't have other men to bring their challenges, their hardship to, what ends up happening is that a lot of female partners end up becoming a man's emotional processing center, where he brings all of his emotional stuff to say, help me deal with this. What do I do? How do I work through this? And when a woman is saying, I want you to open up more, I want you to be more vulnerable, what I've noticed over the years, and this isn't the case for every woman or every relationship, but the majority of women are saying, I want you to know what you are feeling and experiencing, and to be able to communicate to me what you're feeling and experiencing, but also to communicate that you've got it in some capacity, that you are resourced and you have men to talk about it with, you are talking to a therapist or a coach or a psychologist, or that you have a specific thing that you're looking to from me in order to support you. But I need to know that in some ways you've got it. Because if you just bring this big stuff to me, I don't know how to contain it or what to do with it. So I think those are the main pieces. And, for men to know that, that they can open up, that they can be real, they can be transparent with their partner, but there's also such a thing as the right time, the right person, and the right amount, so learning that is valuable.
Yeah. So you say the first step for a man to start their healing process is to recognize the pain in their life, specifically whether they have been a recipient of pain or caused others pain. And then you go into shadow work, which you have a lot of experience and mentorship with, and how important that is. And we can't go through the whole book today, obviously, Connor, but I just wanted to go into that and how obviously you say men have been taught, traditional ways to deal with pain, like suck it up, stuff it down, drink, right? Rinse and repeat.
Numb it out. Don't talk about it. Like some of the stuff that we've been talking about. And, a gentleman that I had on my podcast, I think I wrote this in the book, but like Francis Weller said that your pain has its own intelligence. And so we as men need to understand and get close to our pain to understand it without judgment, without villainizing it, without becoming a victim, without shaming ourselves, learning that art, because otherwise that pain is going to become the intelligence that is convincing us to act out of integrity, to sabotage our relationships, to sabotage our sex life, to sabotage our health and our finances. That pain left unattended will divert your life or shift your life in ways that you don't want it to go. And so you best understand it. And you can see this in every, Joseph Campbell talked about the hero's journey in every myth and mythology, whether it's Greek or otherwise, you see this sort of metaphorical facing and journey that a man must go on to understand his own pain. Whether that's the pain of feeling neglected as a child or bullied, or like you could never live up to the incredible man that your father was. Every man carries a certain type of pain, and he can either do the work to move towards it and understand it, or it will work on him and his life, trying to get him to pay attention. And so we as men need to choose which path we're going to walk. And we can avoid it for long enough, but it will show up, and it might not show up in the ways that we want. So we best turn towards it.
Yes.
It's like pay attention to the oncoming train rather than pretending like it's not barreling down towards you.
Yeah. And I really appreciate that you share a lot of stories of men that you've worked with. And there was a theme that I recognized. There was so many men that didn't know what they're like, I had a great childhood. Things are good. My parents are still married. Oh yeah, really? And then you're digging more into it. Well, how did your dad treat your mom? Don't really want to talk about that. Well, and how did your dad treat you? And this man is thinking, it was a normal childhood. It was good. My parents are still married, or no, his dad did pass away. The one gentleman that I'm speaking of. but turns out he's trying to figure out why he's living in the basement and why it's just like, how did I get myself into this predicament when I had it's not about my childhood. It's not about my pain. And he's just, is that common, Connor, that you're seeing? It's almost like this perception that, I wasn't, physically slept. But then again, this man talks about how he was duct taped to a chair. That is so abusive, right? But he's thinking that that's just normal maybe for boys to be treated like that because you got to man up or.
Yeah. I mean, I think it very much depends on the culture that you've grown up in. But yeah, I mean, I over the years, over the last, 8, 9, 10 years of doing this work, have encountered a lot of men where, there is this notion that there's something to admit weakness or to admit that something happened or transpired in a way that we didn't like or that wasn't good or that was harmful to us is to somehow admit that you're broken or weak as a man. And it's very counter. I mean, if you study things like the art of war, if you study war game tactics, one of the most prominent rules that you need, one of the most primary rules in any war games and in any war tactics is to fundamentally understand your own weaknesses. But in our male and masculine culture, we've thrown that out the window entirely. So what a lot of men will do is, I don't want to admit where I feel weak. I don't want to admit my insecurities. I don't want to admit where I'm struggling. And
that's what you need to do. Right.
And we become blinded to that in the effort of creating the illusion of strength, where if you look at somebody like even David Goggins or Jocko Willink, I mean, these guys are former Navy SEALs. They've done some incredible things. They openly talk about their weaknesses. Some of them are physical, some of them are mental, some of them are their past, I mean, David Goggins has talked about the abuse that he faced in his childhood. He talked about being 300 pounds. And so these types of things are things that we have to admit, right? Carl Jung, who created the notion of shadow work, which a lot of my work is founded on, says that the first step in any therapeutic process or spiritual process is confession. It's the admission of what's actually happening, right? It's why it's the first step in AA. You have to admit that you have a problem. Yeah. So that's the first step that we as men need to take, is admitting where we're struggling, even if it's just to ourselves, even if it's just to a friend, a close friend, to say, you know what, I've been talking as if my marriage has been phenomenal, but we actually haven't had sex in a year, or I've been talking like my business is doing great, but I have 2 months of runway before, whatever. I have to lay off 50 employees and file, BK it, right? File for bankruptcy. So it's just this first step of admission. And for a lot of men, that is the biggest hurdle. It is the biggest hurdle that I faced it. I still face it to this day. Even being in this work constantly, having my own powerful men's group of, 8 other guys that I meet with on a weekly basis who I respect and admire, who challenge me and push me and love me and support me. It's still the hard part to say, oh, I don't want to admit this, but here's how I'm struggling. It's the jumping off the diving board, taking the leap. And I think if anything, I always try and approach every conversation that I do, all the work that I do, is geared towards helping a man in some ways take that first step to just admit that there is something unsavory that's not working in your life currently, so that you can begin to address it. And if you can do that, then there's room for change. But if you can't admit that there's something that you're struggling with, whether that's in your business or your relationship or your health or your mindset, whatever it is, it's just not going to change, right? No. Change is not possible without confrontation, period. Yes. Just not possible without confrontation. And for the majority of us, the threshold of that confrontation is admitting. It's confessing.
Yeah. Awesome. So let's talk about relationships. And,
okay, let's do it.
You talk about how you say women are a mirror reflecting what you are unaware of about yourself as a man.
Yeah.
Whoa. Before we get into this more in depth, what I was thinking about when we were preparing for this podcast, Connor, and I was talking to one of my best friends who I work with her as well. And we were talking about about relationships now and how, women, we've had a lot of girls, we grow up we have this experience of talking about our feelings, talking amongst each other. And this is such a gift for us, right? In the fact that we are community builders naturally. And it's like so almost ingrained to like talk about our feelings and what's going on in our lives. And like we share every little detail, whether we like men like it or not. It's like, oh no, the girls are talking now. Right. And so it's almost like we've had so much practice in this. And then, we're reading the books. I do this for a living. Every week I'm, working and we're reading books and going to therapy myself and talking to therapists. So I feel like I have a really good base knowledge, skills to work through my stuff. Right. And I want a man that's on the same level. And I imagine these are the men that you're being surrounded by, Connor, are men that want to level up. They're like, like the women aren't happy about where I'm at. Like I really need to level up my awareness or go into, the depths of me so that I can be on that same plane of self-development and growth.
Yeah. Yes, 100%. What was the initial question? I feel like
this is more just me talking about it before I get the question out. But then in your book, you do talk about this on just like how our relationships are a mirror of where we're at.
Yes.
Right. And so, you say in the book, the men are asking you, they're going into it, and you're saying the question isn't, is she the right one for me? The question is, how can I better see if I'm being a man I respect when I'm with her? Wow. So this goes for men that are like looking for a partner. They're like, they're looking outside themselves. They're looking for like, okay, what does she look like? What is she like? Right. But more, it's about like, can I be my truest self, my best, my strongest self when I'm with her?
Yeah.
I really liked that perspective.
Yeah. So men are very externally focused, right? And there's a lot of research and data within the evolutionary psychology field and behavioral psychology and a number of different psychological fields that talks about how there's some discrepancy, between men and women, that women are more interested in people and men are more interested in things. And the discrepancy is small but substantial. And so a lot of guys are very externally focused. So when we get in a relationship, we look at our partner and we think, how do I get things right for her? What does she need? How do I fix things for her if she's upset? How do I figure her out? If I can just figure her out, then I can get things right with her, right? So that's very externally focused. And what often gets missed out on are our morals, our ethics, our values, who we are, right? Our reactivity, our anger, our sexual desires, all of those things start to take a back seat because we can get so fixated on who is she? What does she need? What does she want? How do I get it right with her? How do I fix her problems? How do I solve things for her? How do I figure her out? And so much of our consciousness and our cognitive bandwidth and the way that we relate in an intimate way is external. And when we can begin to turn that back around and say, okay, this conflict keeps happening with her. And rather than thinking to myself, how do I fix this? How do I stop this argument? We can turn the lens around and say, who am I being in this conflict? Right? How am I showing up? Am I becoming reactive? Am I being petty? Right? Am I, character attacking? Am I shutting down and walking away and closing off the conversation? And by doing that, we begin to turn our consciousness and our energy and our efforts and our time towards the things that we can actually influence, which is us.
Yes.
We start to take more ownership, more responsibility. We start to see who we are. And very clearly what will start to happen is you'll as a man, you start to move more and more towards who you want to be, how you want to behave, how you want to speak, how you want to act, right? You abide by your morals and your ethics and your standards. And when you do those things, it becomes very apparent whether or not that person is the right person.
Yes.
And it frees them to operate as they want to operate naturally. And you stop trying to change them. You stop trying to alter their behavior or fix them or correct them or whatever. And there's a kind of freedom that shows up in there that all of us as men crave, right? The masculine within us just desires freedom. And so in doing that, we also send a signal to our partner that, hey, I'm moving towards my own stuff. I'm moving towards who I am and what I can control and what I can influence and what I want to focus in on. And it's in that space that we act from a sovereignty, from a sovereign place, from an individual place, and free up our partner to show us their truth, talk about who, what they're actually going through, what they're experiencing. And this is what creates the foundation of intimacy, right? Into me, I see. Not into you so I can try and fix you and get you to be who I want you to be, but into me, I see. Yeah. What's my truth? What's my desire? Can I bring that out more fully? How might I be acting from an insecure place right now? How might I be sabotaging our communication by shutting down or becoming volatile and reactive? And so as we as men can turn towards our own responsibility, we will become more and more aware of what am I willing to tolerate and what am I not willing to tolerate, right? Is this actually in alignment with what I want because I know who I am? Not, is this in alignment with what I want because, I need to figure out that person to figure out if it's right for me. But if I am being who I know I'm capable of being, then it will be very clear to me unequivocally if it's the right situation. And then I'll be acting with respect and confidence and all of the things that are appealing to our partners.
Yeah. I think that's a wrap. No, Connor, that's just so great. Honestly, it really is. I'm passing your book on to all the men in my life. And are you doing an audio? Did you already do an audio yet, Connor?
Yeah.
Or are you doing that?
It's up on Audible. Yeah.
Oh, fantastic. I didn't find it on Audible, but I mean, I love reading. I love reading, love having hardcover. But I recommend everybody that's listening to the podcast, listen to your book, read your book, and pass it on. Man it forward, as you say. And I just thank you so much for our time together, Connor. I look forward to the IG and you answering our community's questions.
I'm excited.
Where else can people find you? So you are, like you said, you do these intensives with men. Tell us about that before we go so that people can sign up for working with you one-on-one if that's possible.
Yeah, I mean, probably the best way is just go to mantalks.com. The book is there. The workshops, there's weekends that you can join. There's virtual groups that you can join. And then there's the podcast. And, I've been doing the podcast for 7 years now. And I've had some cool people like Wim Hof and Gary Vaynerchuk and just some incredible human beings. So yeah, mantalks.com. You're going to find everything you need. And then Instagram at mantalks. You gotta follow along on the Instagram,
Yes, you have to follow along on the Instagram. Well, I love your podcast and everything you're doing is just so great. And I'll continue learning from you, Connor. Thank you again. Please visit realloveready.com to become a member of our community. Submit your relationship questions for our podcast experts at reallovereadypodcast@gmail.com. We read everything you send. Be sure to rate and review this podcast. Your feedback helps us get you the relationship advice and guidance you need. The Real Love Ready podcast is recorded and edited by Maya Anstey. Transcriptions by Otter.ai and edited by Maya Anstey. We at Real Love Ready acknowledge and express gratitude for the Coast Salish people, the stewards of the land on which we work and play, and encourage everyone listening to take a moment to acknowledge and express gratitude for those that have stewarded and continue to steward the land that you live on as well.